The dense forest of Terra Prime stretched for miles, its dark green canopy blotting out much of the sky. Captain Alexander Cole, a seasoned human soldier, stood at the edge of a clearing, looking out over the alien landscape with a mixture of wariness and wonder. This was a place of peace now, or so it had been until recently. The planet was the center of intergalactic diplomacy, a meeting point for different species, where old rivalries were supposed to dissolve, and new alliances forged. Terra Prime was meant to be a sanctuary, a place where humans and aliens could coexist in harmony. But for how much longer? Alexander couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to fall apart. His mission here was simple: to ensure that peace talks between the Xiphorians, the dominant alien race on Terra Prime, and their neighboring species, the Korath, proceeded smoothly. He was part of a small peacekeeping force assigned to safeguard the negotiations and ensure the safety of both human and alien diplomats. Yet something seemed off. The tensions in the air were palpable, and Alexander could sense it from the looks exchanged behind closed doors. There was one person, however, who gave him hope that the talks might succeed: Vira, a high-ranking Xiphorian warrior. She was known for her strength, honor, and commitment to maintaining peace between the species. Her race, the Xiphorians, were a tall, lithe species known for their martial skills and intellect. They had a long history of being peacekeepers, and Vira was one of their brightest leaders. Her role in these negotiations was not just diplomatic but symbolic. She represented the Xiphorian commitment to peace, a sentiment that had inspired Alexander since their first meeting. Their relationship had started purely professional. Alexander had been tasked with ensuring her safety during the peace talks, a duty he took seriously. But over the weeks of their shared duties and constant proximity, a bond had formed between them. Vira's calm demeanor and quiet wisdom had captivated Alexander, and in turn, he had earned her respect through his unwavering dedication to her people's safety. Their conversations often strayed from the cold formalities of diplomacy into matters of personal philosophy, culture, and inevitably emotions. A slow friendship blossomed, and Alexander began to sense that there was something deeper between them, a connection that went beyond their duty. It wasn't long before Vira had shared a deeply troubling secret with him, one that set the stage for the betrayal that would follow. Late one evening, as they walked through the quiet halls of the diplomatic compound, she confided in him. "I have my suspicions, Captain." Vira's voice was soft but filled with tension. "The Korath are not as eager for peace as they claim. I believe they are planning something." Alexander looked at her, his brow furrowing. "What do you mean?" "There are whispers," she continued, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "Certain factions within the Korath tribe have been plotting against the talks. They want to return to war. The peace process threatens their control, and they will stop at nothing to sabotage it." Vira's eyes were fierce as she spoke, but there was a sense of vulnerability there too. Despite her strength, the weight of the political intrigue and her people's fate seemed to be taking its toll. Alexander was no fool. He could see the anxiety in her features. "I'm not sure of who to trust anymore," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I've been watching for signs, trying to find out who among my own people might be involved in this conspiracy, but so far, I've found nothing concrete." "You're not alone in this," Alexander reassured her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I'll help you. We'll figure this out together." But as the days passed, Alexander's efforts to support Vira in her suspicions grew more difficult. Despite his best efforts, the political landscape seemed to shift beneath his feet. The peace talks, which had seemed so promising at the start, began to falter. The alien diplomats, particularly the Korath, grew more belligerent, and every attempt at de-escalating tensions seemed to fall on deaf ears. And then, the unthinkable happened. The night of the attack, Alexander and Vira were in a secure meeting room, discussing the progress of the talks, when alarms blared through the compound. The lights flickered as the automated defenses kicked in, sealing off the building's exits. Vira's expression hardened, and she leaped to her feet, her hand instinctively reaching for the weapon at her side. "What's happening?" Alexander demanded, drawing his own sidearm. But Vira's sharp eyes were already scanning the room, focusing on the security feed on the nearby console. "Betrayal," she whispered, her voice tight with rage. "The Koroth, they've launched an attack." Without waiting for further instructions, Vyra moved swiftly to the door, signaling for Alexander to follow. They raced through the corridors, dodging blasts from automated turrets, and running past the panicked diplomats. The security forces, who should have been their allies, were now turning against them. "What is this?" Alexander asked, his heart racing. "Why would they?" Before he could finish his sentence, a blast of energy hit Vyra directly in the back. She collapsed forward, her body convulsing from the impact. Alexander reached her in an instant, catching her before she hit the ground. She groaned, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and he could see the blood seeping from the wound in her side. "Vyra!" he shouted, his voice filled with desperation. "Hold on, we'll get you out of here!" But she shook her head weakly, her hand gripping his wrist. "No, it's too late for me, but you must survive, Captain. You must warn the others. The peace." Her voice faltered as her strength drained away, and Alexander's heart clenched with a mixture of fear and fury. He had no choice but to carry her, even though the situation was rapidly deteriorating. He fought his way through the compound, determined to keep her alive, but there was no escaping the growing sense of doom. The traitors were everywhere, and every escape route was cut off. When they finally reached the hangar, Alexander thought they were free. But as he tried to board a transport ship, an ambush awaited them. The human soldiers he had once trusted now turned their weapons on him, led by a man he had once called a friend, Admiral Soren, the commander of the human peacekeeping forces. "Captain Cole," Soren sneered, his face twisted in malice. "You've been a thorn in my side for too long. It's time for you to pay for your defiance." Before Alexander could react, Soren ordered the soldiers to open fire. Vyra's paralyzed body prevented her from defending herself, and as Alexander fired back, it became painfully clear that he was outnumbered. In that moment, Vyra looked up at him, her eyes filled with something resembling hope despite the pain. "Finish what we started, Captain. Don't let them win." With those final words, Alexander was forced to abandon his mission to save her. He fought with all his strength, but the overwhelming odds were too much. He was arrested, blamed for Vyra's injury and the betrayal, and left to rot in a holding cell as the peace talks, and the fragile alliances, crashed into chaos. The holding cell was cold, the concrete walls too smooth to offer any semblance of comfort. Captain Alexander Cole sat with his back against the wall, hands cuffed tightly behind him, his mind racing with thoughts of Vyra and the betrayal that had torn apart everything he'd worked for. His body was bruised from the skirmish in the hangar, and the rough handling by the human soldiers who had captured him. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the mental anguish. He had failed her. Vyra, paralyzed and left to die at the hands of the Koroth and the traitors in the human ranks, was now out of reach, and Alexander was alone, abandoned by both sides. For the first time in years, Alexander felt the full weight of despair. The mission he had been so dedicated to was in ruins. The peace talks had failed, and the galaxy seemed on the brink of war. But in the darkness of his cell, amidst the clanging sounds of distant guards and the echo of his own thoughts, one thing burned brighter than everything else: Vyra. She was still out there, and if he could find a way to save her, to undo the devastation caused by the traitors in both the human and alien ranks, he would. It wasn't just duty. It was something more, something that had blossomed between him and Vyra, something deeper than friendship. The connection they had forged over shared moments, struggles, and respect had turned into something he couldn't ignore. He couldn't, and wouldn't, let her die at the hands of those who sought to destroy everything they had worked for. The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridor, bringing him back to reality. Alexander had no illusions about the human leadership's intentions. Admiral Soren had been behind the betrayal, and now they would make sure he stayed locked up. But something was different this time. The footsteps didn't sound like those of a guard. They were deliberate, a rhythm that suggested someone was approaching with purpose. The door to his cell slid open, and a familiar face appeared. Lieutenant Maya Lasker, one of the few remaining members of his original peacekeeping team. She had been a trusted ally, someone Alexander had relied on during countless missions. She looked different now, her face harder, her eyes filled with an emotion he couldn't quite place. "Captain," she said in a low voice, her gaze flicking to the guards at the end of the hall. "You're not safe here. The Admiral is making sure they keep you under lock and key, but there's a bigger issue. The war's about to start, and you're the only one who can stop it." Alexander blinked, trying to make sense of her words. He hadn't been able to hear much while in the cell, but the message was clear: something bigger was happening. Soren was orchestrating more than just his capture, he was actively working to plunge the galaxy into war. But why? What was his goal? "Maya," Alexander said quietly, trying to gather his strength. "What's really going on? Why is Soren doing this?" She hesitated, her eyes darkening. "It's not just about the peace talks, Captain. Soren has his own ambitions. He's working with the Korath to destabilize everything. He's been taking money from them, making secret deals. They've promised him power if he helps them destroy the peace process and ignite a new war, one where the human faction can assert control over the galaxy. He plans to betray us all." The revelation hit Alexander like a hammer. Soren, someone he had trusted, had been working with the Korath all along. The very person he had served under was the mastermind of the chaos that had engulfed the galaxy. And Vyra. Vyra had been caught in the crossfire. "Where is she?" Alexander asked, his voice hoarse with desperation. Maya's eyes softened, but there was little hope in them. "She's being held by the Korath. They've paralyzed her, but they haven't killed her. They need her alive for some reason, but I don't know why. All I know is that if we don't act quickly, they'll either turn her over to Soren or worse." The thought of Vyra's fate sent a surge of rage through Alexander, and despite his physical restraints he stood up, his voice firm. "I'm going to save her. I'll tear that whole planet apart if I have to. I'll find a way, Maya. I won't let them win." Maya gave a resigned nod. "I'll help you, Captain. But you need to get out of here first. The guards are on high alert, and we can't get to the prison cells through the main corridors. I've got a way to get you out, but we'll need to move fast." She reached into her coat and pulled out a small device. "This will override the security system. It's the only chance we have." Alexander's heart beat faster. The plan was risky. They would have to navigate through the prison's underbelly, avoid detection, and then steal a ship to escape the planet. But there was no other option. For Vyra. For peace. For everything that had been destroyed. He nodded, determination burning in his chest. "Let's do it." Maya led Alexander through a series of secret passages, keeping to the shadows, avoiding the guards, and maneuvering through the complex maze of the prison. As they passed through the dark corridors, Alexander couldn't help but wonder how many of the guards were part of Soren's faction. How many were loyal to the true cause. It was hard to trust anyone now, but Maya had always been reliable, and he had no reason to believe she had betrayed him. Eventually, they reached a small maintenance room, and Maya quickly set to work on the security panel. Her fingers moved swiftly, typing in a code that Alexander didn't recognize. The humming of machinery filled the air, and after a tense moment, the door to the outer compound slid open. "Come on," she urged, gesturing for Alexander to follow her. They made their way to the hangar, where several ships were docked, but none of them appeared to be in use. The hangar was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. As they approached one of the smaller craft, a fast, maneuverable shuttle, Maya stopped and turned to Alexander. "I'll stay here and cover our tracks. You go and find Vyra. I've got a contact who will help you from there." Alexander's gaze softened, but there was no time for sentimentality. He understood the gravity of the situation. He couldn't waste a single moment. "Thank you, Maya. Stay safe." Without another word, he boarded the shuttle, his heart pounding as he fired up the engines. The shuttle lifted off the ground, and within moments, they were flying through the atmosphere, heading straight for the Korath stronghold. As the planet's surface shrank beneath him, Alexander's resolve hardened. The galaxy might have been on the brink of war, but he was going to stop it. He was going to save Vyra. He would bring down Soren. And this time, he would make sure the traitors paid for their crimes. The Korath stronghold loomed ahead, a towering fortress carved into the jagged cliffs of Terra Prime's western continent. From the cockpit of the shuttle, Captain Alexander Cole could see the massive structure, its dark spires stretching into the turbulent sky. The once pristine landscape below had become scarred, marked by the constant presence of warships and alien technology. This place, which had once symbolized diplomacy, was now a breeding ground for treachery, a stark reminder of the betrayal that had shattered everything. As the shuttle approached the base, Alexander's grip tightened on the controls. He could feel the weight of his mission pressing down on him. Vyra was inside, somewhere in the depths of that stronghold, her life hanging by a thread. The thought of her, paralyzed and imprisoned by the very people who had sworn to protect her, fueled his determination. He had failed her once, but he would not fail her again. His mind raced through the plan he had concocted. Infiltrate the base, find Vyra, and escape, simple in theory, but fraught with danger. The Korath were ruthless, and with Soren's influence, the entire military might of humanity, and the alien factions stood against him. But Alexander had something none of them had, an unwavering resolve and a heart that refused to abandon the people he cared about. The shuttle settled into a hidden alcove near the stronghold's outer walls. Alexander powered down the engines, leaving the vessel in silence, hidden from prying eyes. The cold air outside hit him like a shockwave as he opened the hatch and stepped onto the ground, his boots crunching against the rocky terrain. He adjusted his tactical gear, checking his weapons one last time, and then set off toward the fortress, his heart racing. As he moved through the shadows, Alexander couldn't help but feel the weight of the past few days. His thoughts kept returning to Vyra, the way she had fought to protect him, the way she had trusted him when no one else did. Her words echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of the promise he had made to her. "Finish what we started, Captain. Don't let them win." The plan was simple: find Vyra, defeat any Korath guards standing in his way, and then escape. But nothing about this mission was simple. The first obstacle was the guard tower at the entrance to the stronghold. It was heavily fortified, with sentries posted at every corner, watching for any sign of trouble. Alexander crouched low, blending into the shadows, watching the patrols pass. The rhythmic pattern of the sentries' movements gave him the opening he needed. He waited for the moment when the guard's gaze drifted away and sprinted toward the tower, staying low and using the terrain for cover. As he reached the tower's base, he activated a small EMP device, disabling the security cameras and locking mechanisms. He entered without a sound, the adrenaline pushing him forward. The corridors inside the stronghold were cold and sterile, illuminated by harsh, flickering lights. The walls were adorned with alien symbols that Alexander couldn't decipher, but he didn't have the luxury of time to study them. He moved quickly, navigating the labyrinth of hallways until he found the first set of guards. 2 Korath soldiers stood at attention, speaking in low tones. They hadn't seen him yet. Alexander's training kicked in, and in a flash, he took them down silently. With practiced precision, he dispatched both guards with swift hand-to-hand strikes, knocking them out cold without drawing attention. His heart pounded as he moved deeper into the stronghold. Every step felt like an eternity, but his focus was unyielding. The voices of the guards grew distant as he moved further into the inner chambers of the facility. At the heart of the stronghold lay a high-security prison where Vyra was being held. According to Maya's information, it was heavily guarded, with only a few high-ranking officials able to access the lower levels where the prisoners were kept. As Alexander reached the first set of doors to the prison block, his thoughts were interrupted by a familiar voice, a voice that sent a chill down his spine. "You should have stayed in your cell, Captain." Alexander spun on his heel to face the source of the voice. There, standing in the hallway, was Commander Dreka, the leader of the Korath forces. The imposing alien towered over him, a grim expression on his angular face. Dreka had been part of the ambush that had nearly killed Vyra, and now he was here, standing in his way. I should have known you'd be behind this, Alexander said, his voice dripping with contempt. What's the matter, Drekka? Are you so insecure in your power that you have to stab your allies in the back? Drekka's expression remained cold. You misunderstand, Captain. This isn't about power, it's about survival. The Korath have always been strong, and the peace process threatens that. The Zyphorians were weak, and your people were naive. It's time for the galaxy to see who truly rules. The words were laced with arrogance, but Alexander knew better than to let his emotions cloud his judgment. He had faced Drekka before, on the battlefield, and knew that the Korath commander was not to be underestimated. This would be a fight of not only strength but also strategy. You'll never win, Alexander spat. The galaxy will unite against you. And when the truth comes out, you'll have no one left to stand with you. Drekka's lips curled into a sneer. We'll see about that. Without warning, Drekka lunged at Alexander, his massive fist swinging toward his face. Alexander ducked and rolled, narrowly avoiding the blow. The fight had begun. The clash between the two was brutal. Drekka was a formidable opponent, his size and strength far outmatching Alexander's. But the human soldier had something Drekka didn't: resourcefulness. He used the environment to his advantage, ducking behind columns and walls, using quick, calculated strikes to wear Drekka down. The Korath commander's brute force was powerful, but it was also predictable. Alexander danced around him, striking when Drekka's guard was down, using his agility to stay one step ahead. The battle raged on for several minutes, each blow echoing through the hall. Alexander was beginning to tire, but he knew he couldn't afford to let up. He had to finish this. With a quick move, he sidestepped another wild punch and kicked Drekka's knee out from under him. The Korath commander stumbled, and Alexander seized the opportunity, knocking him to the ground with a swift strike to the chest. As Drekka lay on the floor, gasping for air, Alexander stood over him, his weapon drawn. It's over, Drekka. You've lost. But instead of surrendering, Drekka looked up with a twisted grin. You think you've won, human? Even if you kill me, you'll never stop the war. You're nothing. Alexander's grip tightened on his weapon, but something stopped him. He wasn't just fighting for survival. He was fighting for Vyra, for peace, for the future of the galaxy. And he realized then that there was more to his victory than just defeating Drekka. There was a choice. He could kill Drekka and let the cycle of violence continue, or he could show the true strength of humanity, compassion. I'm not going to kill you, Alexander said, his voice steady. But I will make sure you face justice. You'll answer for your crimes. With a final, firm strike, Alexander knocked Drekka unconscious, securing him with restraints. He wasn't going to give the Korath commander the satisfaction of dying in battle. Drekka would face the consequences of his actions, and Alexander would ensure that the truth came to light. With Drekka incapacitated, Alexander turned and continued deeper into the stronghold, his resolve stronger than ever. He had to find Vyra, to bring her to safety. And as he moved through the halls, past the silent guards and the twisted remnants of the betrayal, one thing became crystal clear: this fight was about more than just defeating an enemy. It was about restoring the honor and compassion that had been lost in the chaos. No matter what it took, Alexander would save Vyra, and with her, the future of peace in the galaxy. The stronghold was in chaos. The air felt heavy with tension, the faint hum of distant alarms and the sounds of sporadic firefights echoing through the labyrinthine corridors. Alexander had done what seemed impossible. He had incapacitated Drekka, one of the most feared commanders of the Korath forces, and now, the stronghold was on the brink of collapse. Yet, despite the chaos and destruction around him, his mission remained unchanged. He had to find Vyra. He couldn't afford to lose her, not now. Not after everything they had been through together. With every step he took deeper into the heart of the fortress, Alexander's determination only grew. He could feel the weight of the galaxy on his shoulders. This wasn't just about rescuing Vyra. It was about averting a war, stopping the betrayal that threatened to tear apart everything he had worked for. But more than that, It was about proving that humanity had the strength to rise above conflict, to fight for what was right even when everything seemed lost. The security within the stronghold was crumbling as more of Drekka's forces were subdued or fled, but that also meant the corridors were becoming increasingly difficult to navigate. Alexander had to be quick. Every passing minute brought him closer to the possibility that Vyra could be moved or worse, left to die at the hands of the Korath. He moved with urgency, following the faint signs of struggle, the broken doors, and destroyed machinery, the remnants of his earlier battles with the guards. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he arrived at the prison's final chamber. The reinforced door before him was thick and heavily guarded, but Alexander had prepared for this. He had stolen a security code from one of the Korath officers earlier and used it to bypass the outer layers of security. The door clicked open with a mechanical hum, and Alexander stepped into the room, his breath steady, his body tense. The sight that greeted him made his blood run cold. Vyra lay on a cold stone slab in the center of the room, her once powerful frame now motionless, her eyes closed in a deep unconsciousness. She was connected to several medical devices, her body encased in what looked like a containment field. Her paralysis was evident, but her breathing was steady, she was alive. However, it was clear that the devices were designed to keep her immobilized and under constant surveillance. A low growl filled the air, and Alexander spun to face the entrance. Standing there, blocking his path, was a tall, imposing figure, Admiral Soren. "You should have stayed away, Captain." Soren's voice was cold and mocking. "I had hoped you would understand. The galaxy can't be held together by fragile ideals like peace. The Korath understand power. They understand strength. I've made a pact with them, and soon, we'll be in control of everything." Soren's hands were clasped behind his back, his expression one of smug superiority. He was the traitor, the one who had orchestrated the entire plot, the one who had betrayed Alexander, Vyra, and countless others to further his own ambition. But now, face to face with Alexander, Soren's confidence seemed fragile, like a house of cards waiting to collapse. "You've made a deal with the Korath," Alexander said, his voice steady but full of disgust. "You've brought us to the brink of war for power. For what? Control of a galaxy that's already tearing itself apart?" Soren's lips curled into a smile. "You don't understand. I'm ensuring humanity's place in the universe. You, Captain, are too small-minded to see the bigger picture. The Zyphorians, the humans, no one is strong enough to command respect without bloodshed. Peace was never an option. I've built alliances with those who can do what's necessary to keep the peace. The Korath will be the true rulers of this galaxy, and together, we'll rebuild it." Alexander's heart burned with rage, but he knew that the situation was more dire than simply taking down a traitor. Soren was dangerous, not only because of his betrayal but because he had the backing of a significant military force. If Alexander couldn't stop him here, everything would be lost. "You're wrong, Soren," Alexander said, taking a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "There's always another way. You think power is the only thing that matters. But you're forgetting what makes us stronger than the Korath, than you. It's compassion, it's unity. You're blinded by your own greed, and that will be your undoing." Soren's eyes darkened. "You think compassion will save you? You're nothing but a naive fool, Captain. I'll show you what true power looks like." Without another word, Soren drew his weapon, an energy blade that crackled with lethal force. He lunged toward Alexander, moving with deadly precision. But Alexander had no intention of letting Soren succeed. The battle that ensued was fierce, a dance of deadly strikes and counterattacks, as Alexander used every bit of his training to fight back against the Admiral. For a moment, the world seemed to slow. Alexander could feel the weight of the fight, the stakes, the realization that this moment would decide the future. He had already defeated Drekka, but Soren was a different kind of enemy, one driven not by honor, but by ambition and malice. He had to win, for Vyra, for the future, for everything he believed in. Alexander's weapon clashed against Soren's energy blade, sparks flying as they locked in combat. Soren's power and speed were formidable, but Alexander was faster. Every move he made was calculated, a precise strike designed to disarm, to disable, not to kill. But Soren fought dirty, using every trick in the book to gain the upper hand. With a final, swift movement, Alexander disarmed Soren, sending the blade flying across the room. He grabbed Soren by the collar and slammed him against the wall, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "It's over," Alexander said, his voice cold. "You've lost." Soren struggled against his grip, but Alexander held him firmly, ensuring that he couldn't escape. For a moment, Soren's defiance lingered in his eyes, but then, with a look of defeat, he slumped in Alexander's grasp. "You may think you've won, Captain, but you're wrong," Soren muttered, his voice low. "The Korath will not let you stop them. And neither will I." With those final words, Soren lost consciousness, and Alexander, though victorious, did not allow himself a moment of relief. He knew the real battle was still ahead. Soren would face justice, but he still had to save Vyra and stop the Korath once and for all. Turning toward Vyra's motionless form, Alexander moved quickly to disconnect the devices that bound her to the medical equipment. With careful hands, he checked her vitals. She was alive, but weak. Her paralysis, though a grave injury, hadn't taken her spirit. She had fought through the worst of it. She would fight again. He leaned down, his lips brushing her ear. "Vyra," he whispered. "I'm here. You're safe now." For a moment, there was nothing. And then, slowly, her eyes fluttered open, her gaze unfocused at first, but as her vision cleared, she locked eyes with him. Her lips parted, a faint smile curling at the edges, and despite everything, despite the battle and the chaos around them, Alexander felt something inside him shift, something that told him, no matter how long the journey had been, they were finally on the same side. "You came back," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with emotion. "Always," Alexander replied, his heart swelling with relief. "I promised you I would." Vyra's hand twitched, and she reached out, placing her hand on his cheek. "Then let's end this, Captain. Together." As they made their escape from the stronghold, fighting their way past the remaining Korath forces, it became clear that their victory was not just one of strength. It was one of compassion, of the unwavering belief that no matter how dire the situation, they could stand together and fight for a better future. When they finally emerged into the sunlight, with the fortress crumbling behind them, Alexander knew that the battle was far from over. The galaxy still teetered on the edge of war. But with Vyra by his side, with the truth of what they had fought for and the compassion that had driven them to this moment, he knew they had a chance. And so, as they watched the sun rise over the distant horizon, they made a vow to restore peace, to stand against the forces that sought to destroy it, and to never let the darkness consume the light. The galaxy had a future, and they would fight for it, together.